Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar about how to get the reimbursement rates your center or your billing client deserves. I'm Joanna Conti, and I'm founder and CEO of Vista Research Group and also the nonprofit Conquer Addiction, which helps families find effective treatment for addiction. And I'm going to be joined this afternoon by Kevin Isaacs, who's the founder and president of Tribunus Health. So I want to start by saying that the stakes for this problem could not be higher. Just Friday night, I got an email from a long-term client. We've been working with them for 5 or 6 years, and they were providing absolutely wonderful treatment. We know because we were monitoring their outcomes. We were following up with their patients after treatment for the last 5 years, and we consistently had over 50% of their patients in recovery at 1 year post-treatment. And he reached out to tell me that they were shutting their doors. After over 2 decades and treating over 6,000 families, they'd found in the last 3 years that their operating costs had increased by over 30%, and they simply could not get reimbursement rates to increase to the point where it made sense to stay in business. It's absolutely imperative that we give treatment centers the tools they need to negotiate effectively. And this webinar was, the idea for it came when Kevin and I were talking a couple of months ago, and he was sharing with me the incredible data that the pricing transparency law has now made available to people who are negotiating with payers. And I said, we've got to share this with treatment centers out there who are struggling to deal with payers. And at the same time, over the last 6 months, we at Vista have spent a lot of time figuring out how do we help our clients negotiate more effectively with the data that we collect. And so we thought this is a perfect marriage of 2 different topics to help you negotiate more effectively with clients. So I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background on what Vista Research Group does. Since we started in 2015, we have now monitored over 90,000 patients during the time they were in treatment. Most of these are substance use disorder patients because that was our specialty at the beginning. But over the last number of years, we've had an increasing number of behavioral health programs that have also started using Vista for outcomes. And in addition to monitoring patients during treatment, we've also followed up with over 30,000 of those patients after treatment to learn how they're doing. Everything we do is patient reported online. Nope, I didn't jump over that. At the start of treatment, what we do is we collect a lot of information for later benchmarking purposes about what are the patient's primary drug of choice, what's their treatment history, what sort of goals do they have for treatment, a lot of different information about their quality of life metrics, where are they living, where are they working, that sort of thing, and also social determinants of health. And we report all of that to the clinicians at the start of treatment so that they can use that and get an overview of their patient, perhaps before they even sit down with them for the first time. And as you can see, looking at this, it's very useful in terms of pulling the data together in an easy to understand place for use in the biopsychosocial and treatment planning purposes and so forth. We also, at that same intake, will screen and monitor patients for a variety of different co-occurring disorders like depression, anxiety, trauma, eating disorders, suicidality, self-harm, and then for anyone who screens positively for a disorder, then we will take them to a full academically validated scale, which are the same scales your clinicians are already used to using, probably the PHQ-9 for depression, GAD-7 for anxiety, and so forth. And then throughout the time they're in treatment, anyone who is wrestling with an issue is asked on regular update surveys, which typically take about 5 minutes for them to complete, to update on us how they're doing. And all of this information is reported back in real time to the clinicians so they can use it for treatment planning. So what the clinician can do is glance at the most recent patient information before they sit down with a patient, and this allows their therapy sessions to be a lot more productive. We also will analyze in our data analytics platform 65 different patient-reported metrics that managers can look at by program, by payer, by clinician, and by time. And they can see things like, for example, 67% of their patients come into treatment reporting moderate to severe depression. By the time they leave treatment, only 12% of their patients are still reporting this. So they can analyze this and 65 other metrics like primary drug of choice and addiction severity and motivation and treatment completion and demographic information, so forth. They can monitor all of these by all these different areas. Then after treatment, we'll follow up with the patients 1, 6, and 12 months after they leave treatment. Our researchers will reach out to the patients 10 to 15 times at each of those time periods, and they'll reach out by text, they'll reach out by email, and also by phone call. We pay the patients a little bit to take the surveys. We'll instantly send them a Target or a Starbucks gift card as soon as they submit a survey. And we also promise the patients confidentiality. And as a result, we're typically able to reach 45 to 60% of the patients at each of those time periods to learn how they're doing. And these are our results for our abstinence treatment centers since we started. What you can see is, having followed up with about 30,000 patients 1 month after they leave addiction treatment, 42% of them were reachable and told us they had not used drugs or alcohol since they left treatment. And the success rate drops a bit over 6 months and 12 months. But at 12 months, it's still 36% of patients who've told us that they're not using non-prescribed medications or drugs or alcohol for at least the last 30 days and are on their road to recovery. Now, we do also allow some of our centers to serve harm reduction, follow harm reduction principles. And in that case, each patient is asked to set their own goals for what they would consider treatment success. And then we measure their success against the goals that they've set. But in each case, if somebody is using medication such as Vivitrol or Suboxone or whatever, they are, of course, still considered to be meeting their goals if they're not using any non-prescribed or illicit medications or drugs or alcohol. And then we also have very similar information and results for behavioral treatment centers. What we use as the definition of success is whether what percentage of their patients are feeling excellent or good for the last 30 days at 6 months and 1 year post-treatment. So now with that background, let's talk about, what do payers really care about? So I'm going to ask everyone, think of one word. What do you think is the most important thing to a payer? I'll bet we all came up with the same word, the costs. We know that payers are very concerned about their costs. Not only how much did the treatment episode itself cost, that's truly important, but also what happened afterwards that affected what they had to pay for that member. For example, was the member readmitted to treatment shortly after leaving treatment? Did they go back to the ER with an overdose a month later? Or were they hospitalized for some other, say a bad car accident or something like that? And also, because payers recognize that the cost of treating someone is typically driven up if they have issues such as inability to eat a nutritious diet or they don't have stable housing or so forth. It becomes much more expensive to treat that patient because they're not going to the doctor at the first sign of trouble. They're waiting for it to become much worse. So those are some of the factors that are very important to payers because they all tie into how much is it going to cost to treat that member. Now, there are other things, of course, that the payers care about. One is HEDIS measures. What these are measures that are used by governments, by employers, by states to determine how high quality a health plan is. And there's dozens of different HEDIS measures. There's two that are appropriate for behavioral health. One is access to care. How quickly did the patients get into treatment? And the second is a specific focus on depression and how it improved over time. And then, of course, our payers do care about the quality of care also. Did the member get better? And is the member satisfied with the treatment they received? Now, if you have any questions as we're going along, please go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will have time for questions at the end. So please don't forget your questions, write them down now so we can call on you. Okay, so how do we provide our clients with the data they care about so that they can use them in negotiations? So 6 months ago, Vista introduced what we're calling a payer summary report that pulls together the metrics that we know are of most interest to payers for a particular client and a particular payer. So if we're working with a treatment center and they say we're going into negotiations with Blue Cross of Colorado, we will do this report specifically for all the Blue Cross of Colorado members that attended that treatment center during a period of time, so that the client can go into their negotiations with hard data on how Blue Cross's patients did in their treatment. So the first thing, of course, going back to what do payers care about, is the cost. Now, we don't have reimbursement rate data, but I presume that you do. What we can do is we can share with you the median length of treatment for the payers' clients. We also can show you what the readmission rates were within 30 days and 90 days for the members of Payer X who were treated at your center. And we collect information so that you can address what is the impact on future expensive medical interventions. So what you're looking at here is the difference between the pre-treatment year and the post-treatment year in the number of emergency room visits, unplanned hospital stays, detox treatments, and residential or PHP treatments. What you can see is in the year before they started treatment, among the patients that we heard from 12 months later, 54% of them had said they had gone to the ER at least once in the year before they started treatment. And about half of those had gone to the ER twice or more during that pre-treatment year. Now, in the year since they've left treatment, only 18% of these patients had been back in the ER once, and almost all of them had been there only once. And so this savings in the amount of emergency room visits is substantial and important to the payer. You can see that the number of unplanned hospital stays has also declined. The number of detox treatments, the number of residential PHP treatments have also gone down. And we've taken it one step further, and we've actually done an analysis of the healthcare cost and utilization projects, hospitalization databases, where we looked at the cost of an ER visit that was related to addiction or separately related to a mental health issue. And we've calculated the median cost for each of those medical interventions by region of the country. so that we can say that for those reduction in ER visits, each ER visit that was SUD related in the Western District cost about $4,000. And so we can calculate overall that in the post-treatment year, among the patients that we heard from, that the payer saved about $17,600 per member in post-treatment spending. And for these 72 members, they saved 1.3 million overall. Now, I suspect if you go in and you show the payers this information, they'll say, "Oh, that's nice. We'll take it with a grain of salt." Yes, the payers have all of the claims data for these patients. But what I suggest you do is say, this is what our patients have told us. And what I'd like you to do is to double check, confirm what the savings were for our patients before and after treatment, because we're pretty confident it's pretty substantial. And as a result, once you confirm that we have saved a tremendous amount, then we would like to have a reimbursement rate that is appropriate for the amount of money that we've saved you. And the last thing in terms of the cost is the impact on social determinants of health. So what you can see here is that at the start of treatment, 16% of the payers members said that they had trouble having nutritious food to eat. By 1 year post-treatment, it's dropped to 2%. And in fact, 81% of the payers members said that they didn't have any of these social determinants of health 1 year after treatment. So the other things that payers are interested in, let's show them that information also. We can look at access to care. We can show what they're concerned about is, were patients able to get into treatment quickly as soon as they made the decision that they wanted to go? And we can show you for all of your patients that 95% of them were able to get into treatment at your center right away, as soon as they made the decision to go. The payers are going to be particularly concerned with the percentage who had been hospitalized immediately prior to treatment, or those that attended other treatment immediately prior to treatment, because they want to make sure there wasn't any kind of lapse in the treatment. And so this information can be very crucial to them. This is, of course, probably of a lot more interest in Medicaid clients and treatment centers, but it can be useful also for commercial. And then another HEDIS measure, as I said, that is relevant for substance use disorder or behavioral treatment is the depression remission or response measure. And what this shows is that among 156 patients that had moderate to severe depression at the start of treatment, 60% of them on their last survey before leaving treatment scored as having no depression whatsoever, and another 21% had at least a 50% reduction in the severity of their symptoms. Finally, did the member get better? We can show that the members did in a lot of different ways. First of all, you can show the payer that out of their patients that were discharged during this 4-year period, 47% were reachable and said they had not used drugs or alcohol in at least the last 30 days at 1 year post-treatment. And this is substantially above Vista Research Group's norms of 36%. You can also show that not only were they feeling a lot better in terms of depression by the time they left treatment, but they stayed emotionally healthy throughout the post-treatment year. And finally, is the member satisfied? We get a measure of patient satisfaction on every survey they submit, and you can show that 69% of your patients said they were very satisfied with the treatment they were receiving, and another 21% said they were somewhat satisfied. So they were very pleased with the treatment they were receiving. So once again, we will provide our treatment center clients with a payer summary report. We will do up to 3 of these each year for a treatment center. And because we think it's so crucial that you have this data, we don't charge anything extra for these payer summary reports. So I want to close with a wonderful quote from one of Vista's long-term clients. Chris McIntosh is the CEO of Turning Point Centers. And he told us that having Vista's outcomes research really differentiated Turning Point with potential payers. In fact, he said, without it, I doubt we would have won a highly competitive contract that's been worth over $20 million in revenues to us to date. Outcomes research will help you negotiate with payers because it will differentiate you. They will know you're serious about your outcomes and that you're doing everything possible to help your patients recover. So if you'd like to see a copy of our payer report, you can download this here at Vista Research Group /payer-report. If you'd like to learn more, please reach out to me by email, or here's my cell phone number. And I know we have a number of billing companies on this call. So my ask for you is, if you have any clients that you think would really benefit from outcomes research, please email them and introduce me. We'll take it from there. And we really appreciate the recommendation. So with that, we're going to hold any questions you might have for me till the end, and I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really happy to have this opportunity to present with Joanna and Vista. We have admired the work they've done since, honestly, before I started Tribunus a little over 5 years ago, and have used some of the data from the reports that they create in negotiations. So I can say firsthand that it is impactful. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how it's impactful here today. So like I said, or like Joanna introduced me, I'm Kevin Isaacs. I founded Tribunus Health. And so what we do is help providers maximize their in-network rates with payers. We are really experts in helping organizations put their best foot forward in payer negotiations that we then carry out on their behalf. So if you as a provider organization are an NFL player, we're your agent, right? Like, it's widely accepted that NFL agents are helpful, and it's not just because like players can't do it themselves, but an agent has the perspective and the data from decades of experience doing these negotiations with these same exact football teams. So generally they've got a more accurate view of a given player's value and worth relative to the competition. And taking some of those anecdotes, right, like that a player might hear in the locker room from their teammates about how much they make, taking some of that emotion out of the process, especially when you've maybe historically not had such a great relationship with the front office, that being the payer. Trying to fight for reimbursements every day doesn't always give folks the warm and fuzzies. So that's the role that we play here, is going from you've been playing, Joanna's been logging stats, and now it's time to secure a new deal, and we're kind of the folks you come to for that. So like I said, I'll see if I can move slides here. What we concentrate on, really twofold, is our bread and butter. It's new network processes, helping folks go in network for the first time. This is really common in the behavioral health space, where folks were coming from cash paid out of network billing and now looking to move in network. That's really almost all of what we did when we got started, and most of that in the SUD space. And then obviously helping folks with renegotiations. So really we're trying to focus on people who have a superior model of care. How do they get paid for that value that they're creating? How do you get the reimbursement rates that you deserve, basically? And so, we pick up the baton often where it's dropped off. Once those outcomes are created, someone has to take them and do the thing. And so whether those outcomes, like your outcomes research is nascent, whether you just started or whether it's decades old and you have year over year longitudinal data, you know, we're not only going to use that, but we're going to describe the full set of circumstances that set you apart. You know, that could be the network adequacy of the payer that you're trying to reach, how long it takes to get an appointment with them or get a bed with them in reality, not just what they're saying on their website. Anything particular to the geography where you might be, whether that's the scope of the problem in that particular place, or maybe something about the competition or lack thereof. Bringing all that to the fore to craft a narrative surrounding what makes you different and what makes you special is a huge part of what we do. And then, you know, we pair that with action, right? So taking this message up the ladder, it's like having that report is huge. Delivering it to the right person in the right setting with conviction is can really create the right differential. And, you know, you have to have that meeting. And so both kind of knowing who to go to, when to go to them, is a big part of what we've seen create the most lift in these negotiations. Speaking of negotiations, just having that expertise to know when to start, when to stop without destroying a relationship. Like, you have to remember this will be a multi-year relationship, right? And so, you know, sort of how you act during that process can be material to long-term success. And you might be giving up some points in the short term to gain in the long. And so again, just having that perspective is pretty critical. And lastly, like, always just having that analytical rigor. And so much of this is knowing what's going to happen after you sign that piece of paper. I mean, you'd be surprised how many of these contracts are signed without a really good comparison of here's current state, here's future state once you sign the paper. And so being able to take that and know exactly what the impact's going to be is, you know, one of the main reasons we're hiring for that sort of certainty that it provides. And so historically, you know, that's like everything I just described is about as good as we could do. You know, once we delivered that message, it was really in the payer's hands to evaluate on their side the cost versus the quality, and then give you a number that may or may not have anything to do with your quality. And so the result, I think everyone here can agree, has been a really inefficient market for healthcare services. And I'm not just talking about SUD here, but across the board. There is no correlation between cost and quality in our current healthcare market. And so I'm sure everyone on this webinar has sat through a number of value-based care webinars and how that's going to be the next great thing to get us there. But, you know, so far, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's been a lot of talk with not a lot of reality for probably over a decade. And so I just kind of want to take us back to like first principles about what it takes to create an efficient market in healthcare. And there's really, you know, two ingredients for market efficiency. One, measuring how good services are relative to one another. You know, if you're looking at hair salons, this could be something like Google reviews. That just doesn't exist, at least in a way that you would trust it for healthcare. And so, you know, on number one there, we feel pretty good that Joanna's cracking the nut. And those type of outcomes are what can distinguish one person from another. And again, that's one way that we're going to get there. We need that other ingredient, which is knowing how much services cost relative to one another. And so to go back to our NFL analogy, this is data that's out there in the NFL. You know how much Justin Jefferson is making relative to the next wide receiver. And so, you know, that allows NFL agents, at least, to better craft a narrative. Like, the data is all out there and you can speak plainly to each other. In healthcare, there's still a fog here. Especially historically, there was no way, contractually at least, to know what your neighbor was getting paid. And so without that information, you're negotiating with one hand tied behind your back. And so that's really what I'm here to talk about is some new legislation that has changed the game there. And so, look, you don't see headlines like this in healthcare. Cleveland Clinic resets the market for cancer treatment revenue, but not yet. Like our goal is that you will be able to, thanks to this new data. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that came about and then what we're doing with it. So that eventually we'll be able to compare your rates, payer by payer, code by code. So originally, this price transparency data, that's what it's called if you want to kind of Google around it, came from a law that went into effect in 2020. And initially, this was all about hospital pricing. That was the first part of it that went into effect. And you've probably, if you follow any healthcare news, seen a lot of ink spilled over hospital price transparency. And this was where the hospitals themselves were asked to list their prices for certain services. Compliance was really bad. They ended up, like the data itself wasn't good even when they complied. So it was hard to sort of navigate around. They started, like the penalties were bad, so they increased the fines. They still weren't that high. Anyway, tons of ink spilled over the hospital. While that happened, while all that ink was being spilled, there was a second part of the price transparency legislation that came along, which mandated that all the payers had to start releasing all of their rates with every in-network provider. Much more powerful, but since it's kind of harder to understand, not a lot of ink spilled about it, starting to be a little bit more now. But the problem with it was that it was really hard to deal with. There's so much data that, I'll show you a version of it in a second when you go try to download it yourself. You can't get anything that's insightful just by clicking in on your own, really. And this is mostly because a little bit is the construction, but most of it is because just the sheer size. And this is like 6 Netflix's worth of data that's being released every month. And so in order to parse that monthly, right, it takes a powerful engine, and those sort of server costs can really add up over time if you imagine. And so when that happened, we set about going to figure out how we could do it in a cost-effective way. Partner with a lot of different folks who didn't quite get it until we finally found the right ingredients. And so I can tell you a little bit about the ingredients. So if you Google, for instance, UHC MRF, a machine readable file, you'll get to a page that looks like where you see transparency and coverage there on the top right, and it'll have a list of files. If you download one of those, which is going to be like a couple gigabytes, you'll get and have the right sort of file, text file reader, you'll get that little green section there, and they're in really no order. It's gobbledygook. You won't see any provider names. You'll see what a procedure code is and some prices, but it's hard to connect with reality, and it won't necessarily be your code or even your state. So what we did is find a way to filter all the data out there for any particular query and bring it in for any payer you can think of across the country. And again, these are all commercial payers, and put it in an Excel sheet. And once it's in an Excel sheet, what our tool does is create some handy visualizations to be able to show you where you sit in the market compared just to your peers. And so that's really the core functionality and why I think it coming from Tribunus is important, because we built this with a purpose, and that purpose was to help providers understand where they sit in the market for what they do, so that they can better say, okay, I know I'm here quality-wise, but I'm here payment-wise. Why aren't those the same? And so eventually, once there is both transparency and quality and transparency in what people are paid, the market can get more efficient, and you can have, healthcare looking a little bit more like the market for a new car, a haircut, what have you. Again, feel free to enter stuff in the Q&A. I know this is normally where folks chime in when I'm doing this one-on-one, and we'll answer them at the end of the call. So what can we do with this data now that we have it? I thought maybe the best way to talk about this would be like the old infomercials where you've got the angry lady in black and white moving the vacuum cleaner, and then the new world we're in now. So in the old world, without price transparency or outcomes data, providers would be just asking for rate increases, hoping that the payer would say yes for inflation reasons or because they're not paid enough and costs are going up. And those things are all true, but they're also not convincing as far as a payer is concerned. And so, like I said, arguing with one hand behind your back. And, it was really asymmetric because payers knew what everyone was getting paid and had the ability to at least guess at quality, but would never share that information with you. And now where we are is a different place. Like you can know where you are stacked up quality wise and payment wise against your competition when you enter into the negotiation, so that you can make a common sense proposal that pays you what you deserve for the outcomes that you're creating. Yeah, and I think the other important piece to our data is, you're not just being compared against the market at large. You're 33rd percentile, and you see the 75th percentile rate is why. You can see that the provider down the street who does what you do and has a bunch of people fail out of treatment is getting paid more than you or less than you or whatever it is. So it gets very specific as well, which kind of is the genesis of the power of this data. So our use cases, and I'm going to give you examples of both of these here next. Again, negotiating contracts. And so we can use it to do this for you, or if you negotiate on your own, we can provide you the data to help you do this on your own. But again, I think you can probably see how that works. And then growth strategy wise, this has been kind of a surprising piece of the market for us. Because it wasn't our bread and butter, but this data has allowed us to really help folks fine tune their growth strategy. And I'll give you an example of that here soon as well. So this is kind of the bread and butter use case of the price transparency data. We have a provider who, they'll send us their top 5 codes, or we'll take a look at their reimbursement data and figure out what the top 5 codes are, and just take a look at everyone else in their taxonomy, which it might be 3 providers in their state or 3 providers in a certain county, or it could be 500, depending on how narrow the parameters you want to set. And we'll say, okay, look, all these little orange dots are our target providers' rates relative to the blue dots, which are the market. And you can see here that they're pretty systematically underpaid across all 5 different codes. And so, to the extent that I'll go on to the next one here. So then maybe we want to check out one of these codes specifically, because they certainly look way under the market. But once you check it out specifically, they're not way under market. They have the most common rate. So this might be 100% of the payer's fee schedule, but it's also really clear that other providers have higher rates. So differentiable rates are possible here. So if you're hearing from a payer that no, everyone's paid the exact same, we never deviate from our fee schedule, which is extremely common, we have proof here that that is not true. And we know exactly who those people are who are getting differentiated rates, which is there, that 3rd column. And some of these were indeed this client's direct competitors, the folks down the street who have older infrastructure that's kind of crumbling, and the provider felt that they offer superior care to. And so then we have rationale to go to the payer and say, what gives? We're providing better care, we're providing better outcomes. These guys do have a robust outcomes tracking program in place, and we're able to use that to successfully negotiate better rates. I guess one other piece I'll mention here, you don't always share this data with the payer first thing. Very often we'll use this data to help craft an initial offer and then respond to the various counters that happen throughout a negotiation process. And often this is the last thing we'll share with the payer to bump it up from what was their best and final to what becomes their best and final. And that's been a pretty powerful usage of it. Lastly, and this goes back to the sort of growth strategy piece, we had a client come to us and they were just looking for some very specific competitors and what they get paid from the major payers. This is an SUD provider. They were looking to buy a facility in a new state. They knew after they retrofitted the facility from what it was to the detox and residential treatment center it was to become, about where they would sit in the market and the competitors who they would most look alike. And so we wanted to see how do those rates compare payer to payer. So what can we expect from Cigna to United to Anthem? And then additionally, how the provider rates compare to each other. And so who's the best, who's the worst, who's in the middle. And a big thing here for them was validating their pro forma. And so, you know, they're looking to expand into a new city, state, what have you. What kind of rates should I expect? Because very often, you know, geographically, what you're getting in New York isn't necessarily what you're getting in New Jersey. And so here's an example of sort of part of the data package that we provided for them. There you can see what we call the benchmark report in the middle. And again, that orange rate is our target providers rate. And so in this case, we were looking up 4 facilities, Landmark Recovery, 2 Journey Pure facilities, and a facility called Cumberland Heights. And we compared them to all of the other providers that had their same taxonomy in Tennessee. And specifically, we're looking at that for Tennessee, Cigna, and United. And so this 0126 report, that's for detox, and this is BCBS Tennessee. And so you can see that Landmark Recovery is the target provider, and they have a rate of $755. That's about average, right, for this state and this type of provider. Meanwhile, Cumberland Heights is over here on the right. They've done clearly a very good job over time negotiating these rates, and perhaps that's because of their outcomes. Perhaps that's because they've been very persistent and very sort of active in negotiations over time. And so the client was able to take this data and say, okay, we can sharpen our pencil on the rates. And then they ended up adjusting their purchase, like their offer price for the facility based on this new knowledge. Because they had a more definitive idea of what they could expect in year 1 as a network provider, which is more to the left here, and maybe what they could expect in year 4, 5, 6 as they renegotiated those rates and kind of moved up the distribution. And so I'm going to end it here. You know, hopefully we can get to a point where facilities are making those headlines. And we can figure out that someone just reset the market for detox and what everyone's going to aim for. I think eventually that hopefully we can get to a space where we can do value-based care, but in a fee-for-service context. But it takes 2 sides. It takes transparency on outcomes and also transparency on pricing. And so I think, you know, for every one of our clients, especially clients that we can have together, will benefit from the combination of someone who knows things that others don't really. Because if you're in the NFL, like from agent to agent, right, like all the information is known. Every agent knows how many catches you got last season. But in this case, more value can be created by having a partner who has that data. And so hopefully you've seen throughout this presentation how having both sides of that data leads to differentiable insight, and then having the action that creates better rates is ultimately the final piece of the puzzle that can help you grow. So yeah, I'll leave it off there and we can pop into the Q&A. Jessica, were you going to run that, or Joanna, do you have all the questions here?
All right. Let's see. Joanna, you want me to read the questions off for you guys?
Yeah, maybe stop sharing so we can see everyone. Kevin, can you? Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Why don't you pick some of the questions and you can tell us who you're asking each one?
It looks like they were all anonymous, but how quickly can we get a payer report once we start using Vista?
Well, it takes a little while for us to get the data, of course. We can get you going, starting monitoring your patients typically within, a week or two, or Stacey will say 3. We can get you going very quickly, but then it takes, a year or so before we have a sufficient amount of data that we can report like a year's worth of patients, or beginning patients at least their 6-month data. So typically it'd be somewhere around just a little over a year. We could start having strong data that we can help you use in your negotiations with a payer summary report.
Wonderful. Can you tell me what the data says about my clients' rates relative to the competition?
Yeah, so that's it sounds like that one's from a billing company specifically. And so we actually have partnerships with certain billing companies to go not only like work on behalf of their clients, but help them identify like who are the best targets for renegotiations. And so if you think, let's say you have, I don't know, 20 clients, it could be 200 clients. If you send us that data where it's just client A, like every instance where they build every code that they've ever built, and this maybe it's over the last 6 months, so it's not a crazy file. We can determine where folks are getting underpaid the most with which payers, and then how much value we think can be created in that negotiation. And so those are cases too that can be really powerful because we can even do something like more success-based. Because we have an idea that there's a lot of meat on the bone in certain situations, and can align incentives very well around that. And then I saw that we also had a question from Michelle, who says they're a small private practice neuropsychological clinic, and you're not having success with negotiations. Kind of what can I do? Michelle, I think that the first thing is that I don't really care how big a client is. The first thing that we hear when we go and try to negotiate for someone is no. And so for us, that's just the opening bid. And so much of this is persistence, but you also can't discount that a part of it is size. And so if it's just a single provider, there's not going to be a ton of leverage that someone has to get rates that are differentiated from what the whole market is. You saw, for instance, that first benchmark report I did where the orange line was kind of in the middle of the really tall one. If you're a truly tiny provider, it's going to be hard to sort of escape the gravitational pull of the market rates. But if you have outcomes, you're not just sharing what your outcomes are, but those outcomes are differentially better than everyone else. I think you can keep pushing. And eventually you'll break folks down and kind of get to the right person. That's another thing that we help folks out with, is sort of navigating that bureaucracy so that you're giving that presentation or telling your story to the right audience.
Awesome. I see another question that's probably from a billing company as well. Can the price transparency data help facilities decide if they should go in?
Yeah, so I take that one too. Yes is the short answer. So if you think about like the math behind it, and we could work with a billing company to help figure this out, but out of network, you're getting paid a certain thing on average from a certain payer. With the price transparency data, we could go look at everyone who looks like you that's in network and say, this is the range of outcomes that are possible in an in-network environment. And so I know I've abused this NFL analogy at this point, but you have to realize as a rookie, like you're going to be on the rookie pay scale, which is more set than if you've been in the network league for like 5 or 10 years. And so because of that, like I mentioned for the Tennessee facility, you're more likely to have kind of that higher bar. Something that's on the left side that most other people have. And so that's probably the rate that once we show it to you, you should be looking at and saying, is this above what I'd be getting in an out of network perspective? And it's probably not, it's probably lower. And so considering that it's lower, is the volume that I expect to get from being in network from this particular payer worth going in network? And that's the other beauty, is that you can start targeting who to go in network with first based on what that rate environment is looking like. And this isn't just hearsay. So, historically, what we'd have to do is go talk to 20 payers on your behalf. That would take 12 months, right? And then you could pick the ones that made sense. In this case, we can only target the ones that we know beforehand could make sense. And that, makes it easier on us and less costly on you.
Wonderful. All right, another question is, can I just buy the data?
Yeah. So this presentation, I guess I did focus a lot on our use of the data in our negotiations, but we also can just sell kind of discrete, discrete data analyses. And so we would have someone work with you to define exactly what you're looking for, and then deliver that, whether that be, 5 codes and 3 payers, or you're looking at all 50 states and trying to figure out where can I get the best rate from the prevailing Blues plan on this exact code. So that can be, as big as you want, or, ideally, I think from a cost perspective, as small as you want.
All right. And let's see. And how is the data different from other rate data available?
Yeah, so the other rate data that's available is based on claims, nearly universally. And so it has to be, and this is, I think, based on some regulations that apply to the clearinghouses that provide that data. It has to be aggregated in a way that makes it very general. And so you don't end up getting sort of by provider, by code, by payer level specificity. And additionally, it is, there's pros and cons of this, but it's biased towards the larger providers who are billing more, because it's, again, based on claims data, which has a volume component to it. In certain cases, like, if data from like a Fair Health were to give you the average price in the state of Wisconsin, for instance, that average price is going to be, hundreds of dollars higher than the price that you would receive as a new provider in that state, because so much of the volume is carried by one organization whose rates you or no one else that's ever started a business in that state will ever be able to touch. And so getting something like just an average in Wisconsin is, it not only is misleading, but it can potentially be very damaging, because you're going in there with assumptions about profitability that are just completely false.
All right, and our final question, they said, can you talk about how your services, Vista and Tribunus, support one another, which you kind of shed a little bit of light on earlier, but they also asked, do I need both?
I think you'd have to say they're very complementary. You can use outcomes research only, and you can go in and negotiate blind on how your pricing compares, or you can use price transparency information and go in there with, perhaps much rougher quality information. I think they're very complementary. If I were negotiating and the fate of my company relied on the reimbursement rates that I was able to negotiate, I would want to go in there with all the relevant data I could. I don't know, Kevin, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I could put it better. I tried to say it not very eloquently at the end of my part of the presentation, but again, it's like, to get to an efficient market for healthcare services, you need to know how good you are, or how good a given organization is relative to the competition, and how much folks are being paid relative to the competition. And so the more data that's more available on those two topics, the closer we can get to market efficiency. And in the meantime, while there still is fog surrounding both of those topics, because this is not universally available data today. There's a ton of value in being one of the organizations that has both of those data points when everyone else is just over there saying, pay me more because I deserve it. You can say, I deserve it because of A, B, and C. And that's a lot more powerful, and that's ultimately how you get work done in this space.
I'll just say, you know, I went to a talk at one of these conferences, I think last fall, where they were talking about the potential for price transparency to really revolutionize healthcare. And I thought, this is so incredibly useful and interesting. And so I am just, my hat is off to Kevin and the folks at Tribunus Health about what they've been able to do to take these terabytes of data and massage it down to where it can be useful in any individual providers making you know, decision about how they're going to negotiate and what is a fair reimbursement rate. And this is cutting edge stuff. And Kevin, I'm really excited for the difference that your organization's going to make in this market.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And you know, Joanne, I think the thing that made me so excited to meet originally was our kind of shared mission here to ultimately increase access to these services and, you know, help the cream rise.
Yes.
And if we can do that, I think we're in the right direction, and hopefully some folks on this call here can allow us to fulfill that mission at a higher level.
Fantastic. Well, I don't know whether, I guess we'll just wrap up at this point, unless there's any other questions.
Thanks so much, Joanne. I really appreciate everyone who was able to attend.